Was Jesus truly predicted by the prophets of the Old Testament?
Great question.
Some people reject some of the predictions, some of the prophecies they don't think are valid.
Oh, who might some of those people be?
These prophecies they're citing as messianic, Jews don't think those are messianic. I'm reading the plain text in the Old Testament, and I'm thinking, I wouldn't even assume this is messianic. This seems like it's describing the nation of Israel, or it's describing something that David did. Why would you think this is describing a future coming Messiah? Like, if you look at all these New Testament, half these dang things don't even seem like they're talking about the Messiah. And if you ask an ancient Jew, they would never have said that was even messianic to begin with. So if you're going to use those kinds of statements you happen to clip out of the Old Testament to make your case for Jesus, I'm out.
Well said and good point. Maybe we can make a skeptic out of you yet.
This is lame. Why should I trust any of your prophecies when half of them seem like they're not that clear? They're all cloaked.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians.
I know there's lots of pastors, and you've probably read books. Maybe you've got this. There's people who I would say, hey, what do you think the strongest evidence is for Jesus being, God? They'll say, well, it's prophecy. It's fulfilled prophecy.
There seem to be plenty of born and raised Christians who think this way.
But my question, of course, as a new investigator was, why would anyone think this is all that impressive? I'll be honest. As I listened to people tell me that prophecy predicted Jesus, I actually went to those Old Testament prophecies and I was decidedly underwhelmed.
I'm with you, Jim. Even when I was a Christian and knew only a fraction of what I do now about the problems in this line of thinking, I was decidedly underwhelmed with these so-called prophecies.
He no longer believed that the prophecies that were usually cited by New Testament authors were legitimate prophecies to begin with. In other words, he felt like those New Testament authors were twisting somehow the scriptures that allegedly prophesied about the appearance of Jesus and making them fit their own narrative, much the way that sometimes Mormon authors would do, or Joseph Smith would twist prophecy in order to predict something that Joseph did.
That is excellent insight. If you look up those so-called prophecy passages and read them in context, that's exactly what you see. When you're already a believer, you're willing to talk about biblical prophecy in some nuanced ways that are not the kind of straightforward predictions coming true that a skeptic like myself is looking for. Christian thinkers developed interpretive methods like typology and midrashing to connect different parts of Scripture symbolically. Typology sees Old Testament elements as foreshadowing New Testament counterparts. For instance, viewing Jesus as a new Adam or the Passover lamb. Midrashing, derived from Jewish tradition, uncovers deeper meanings by linking stories and phrases across different biblical passages. Both methods seek to reveal underlying unity and divine purpose throughout the Bible's diverse texts. When the gospel authors talk about fulfilling prophecy, this is usually what they're doing. When Bible prophecies appear unfulfilled, Christian apologists employ interpretive concepts. Contingent prophecy treats predictions as conditional upon human actions, like in the Jonah and Nineveh story. Dual fulfillment suggests prophecies can have both an immediate historical fulfillment and a future one, often connected to Jesus or end times. Symbolic fulfillment interprets prophecies metaphorically rather than literally, focusing on spiritual meaning over historical accuracy. These approaches help reconcile apparent prophetic failures while preserving biblical authority. But we're here to examine the claim that fulfilled prophecy is convincing evidence for the truth of Christianity. And that means looking at prophecy through the lens of a skeptic, not a believing defender. If you're familiar with my channel, you may be aware of my 6 criteria that must be met in order for me to be impressed by a prophecy claim. I think they're clear and straightforward. The prophecy must be 1. Made clearly and demonstrably prior to the events predicted. 2nd, intended to be a prediction. 3rd, a non-mundane claim. 4, answerable only by a single, clear, verifiable occurrence. 5, not open to interpretation. 6th, not something people are actively attempting to fulfill. We'll reference back to these as Jim lays out his case.
Turns out that several of the Old Testament prophets predicted historical events in addition to predicting the coming Messiah. And these historical events actually occurred.
Jim's sidestepping the Jesus question for now in order to establish some prophetic credibility first within his former police detective framing and marketing gimmick.
This is the definition of what it is to be a reliable informant. Basically, what it means is they have had to predict that to give you information that you then found out was true as part of your investigation. And once that happens, and they've been tested, they actually have provided information that you discover is correct. They can be called a reliable informant.
I'm looking forward to running Jim's examples through our skeptical prophecy checklist.
Let me just show you a few of these so you can, all of them, so you can see them here. Nahum, for example, predicts the destruction of Nineveh, but he prophesizes it just a few years before it actually happens. So for me, as an atheist skeptic, I was like, really? A couple of years, that's just too close to the event. I mean, how do you know when he actually wrote it? Maybe he wrote it when it actually happened.
Yes, that's criterion number 1. And thus we can establish that a prophecy was clearly and demonstrably made prior to the events it predicts. It's not an impressive prediction. Hindsight is 20/20, as they say.
But if you accept the dating of Old Testament scholars, this is a prophecy of Nahum that actually occurred, the destruction of Nineveh. Okay, that's 2 years prior to its destruction. To me, it was a little bit too tight.
Nahum's prediction is often seen by modern critical scholars as an informed anticipation based on observable political realities, combined with a theological proclamation expressing hope for the overthrow of an oppressive empire. This approach suggests Nahum's prophecy is less about supernatural foresight and more akin to someone here at the end of 2024 predicting escalating hostilities in the Middle East, increasing extreme weather events, market disruptions due to artificial intelligence, or the passing of former President Jimmy Carter. Since Wallace's case isn't going to rest on this one.
Now, just for the sake of argument, because you know I'm a jerk, I'm going to toss out the one that's Nahum because it's only a couple of years between. So let's say you just were really skeptical about that, dude. Fine. Toss him out.
We don't need to get too far into these details today and can happily agree to ignore it.
Okay, let's just go one more. How about Isaiah? Isaiah predicts the destruction of Babylon. And that prediction occurs actually a lot earlier than the Nahum prediction. That's back about 150 years. That was more impressive to me, right? Predicts that destruction. It actually occurs.
Around 700 BCE, when Isaiah was a religious teacher in ancient Israel, the powerful empire of Assyria ruled most of the Middle East. At this time, Babylon was just a small kingdom controlled by Assyria. However, some passages in the book of Isaiah describe Babylon as a mighty empire that crushes other nations, something that only happened much later, around 600 BCE, when Babylon became powerful under kings like Nebuchadnezzar. This timing issue suggests these passages were written later than traditionally believed. The passages also contain surprisingly specific details. For example, Isaiah 45:1 names a Persian king called Cyrus as God's chosen one who would free the Jewish people. This is unusual because most ancient prophecies spoke about unnamed future leaders. We know from Persian records that Cyrus claimed he was chosen by gods to take over Babylon, very similar to how Isaiah describes him. This suggests both accounts were written around the same time, after Cyrus had already become famous. The writing style also offers clues. Ancient writers often described past events as if they were predictions to show that God controlled history. We see this technique in other ancient texts from Babylon and in parts of the Bible, like the book of Daniel. In Isaiah's case, this writing style probably aimed to comfort Jewish people who were living in exile. Chapters 40 to 55 of Isaiah feel different from earlier chapters. They focus on comforting exiled people and promising their return home. These themes make more sense if written during the time when Jewish people were exiled in Babylon rather than 150 years earlier. Finally, some of Isaiah's predictions didn't come true as described. The text says Babylon would become completely abandoned, but archaeology shows people lived there for hundreds of years afterward. Cyrus actually made Babylon an important city in his empire, and later Alexander the Great wanted to make it his capital. The prophecy also says the Medes would violently destroy Babylon, but history shows the Persians took over peacefully under Cyrus's leadership. In short, it is not clear to experts in the field that these Isaiah passages were written before the events they claim to predict. They fail criterion number 1.
A lot of people, for example, skeptics, will do their best to twist everything and do their best to try to put Isaiah dated at a different time because they hate the fact that he was actually able to do this accurately.
Did my summation sound like it was twisting facts or motivated by hate? Thousands of pages have been written on the prophecies in this first part of Jim's presentation, and almost all the discourse centers around complex interpretations of the valid and generally uncontested observations about the texts themselves, and virtually none of it is motivated by hate. Not only are the observations themselves nearly universally acknowledged, plenty of God-fearing, resurrection-affirming Christians agree with the skeptical interpretations that I'm presenting in the briefest possible fashion, since they're not the main point of the video. I'd encourage you to dig into each one for yourself. Jim is free to hold the most credulous, simplistic, and unnuanced interpretations possible, but that he expects his acceptance to move the needle for a non-believer is beyond naive.
Turns out that Ezekiel predicts the destruction of Tyre. Now, he prophesizes this about, actually pretty impressive, about over 150 years prior to it actually occurring. So we have another pretty good gap in time, another prophet who predicts something that's going to happen in history, and history reveals that his prediction was accurate.
The biblical prophecy concerning Tyre's destruction in Ezekiel 26 stands as one of the clearest cases of unfulfilled prophecy in the Old Testament. According to ancient historians and records,
King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon attacked Tyre for 13 years,
586 to 573 BCE, but couldn't capture the city, which was built on an island. What's most interesting is that Ezekiel himself seems to admit this failure in a later prophecy, Ezekiel 29:17 through 20, written 16 years after his original prediction. In this later text,
Ezekiel says Nebuchadnezzar got no reward from the campaign against Tyre,
and explains that God would give him Egypt instead, which failed to happen as well, essentially acknowledging that things didn't go as initially predicted. The prophecy said Tyre would be reduced to bare rock and never rebuilt. However, history shows that Tyre continued to be a successful trading city throughout several empires, Persian, Greek, and Roman. Some defenders of the prophecy point to Alexander the Great's conquest of Tyre in 332 BCE as fulfilling the prediction. However, this interpretation has problems. Alexander's conquest happened 250 years after Ezekiel's prediction, used different methods, building a land bridge to reach the island, and involved a different ruler than the one Ezekiel specifically named,
Nebuchadnezzar.
After Alexander conquered it, Tyre quickly went back to being an important port city, the opposite of Ezekiel's prediction that it would never be rebuilt. In fact, Tyre still exists today as the Lebanese city of Sur, with over 100,000 people living there, and is considered so historically important that it's protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. While prophets often used exaggerated language, Ezekiel's prediction included 3 specific details that didn't happen: who would conquer the city,
Nebuchadnezzar,
how complete the destruction would be, total and permanent, and what would happen afterward, never being rebuilt. The fact that these specific predictions didn't come true, combined with Ezekiel's own later acknowledgement, suggests this was a human prediction rather than a divine message about the future. This Ezekiel prophecy fails criterion number 4, that the predicted event demonstrably happened.
This is also true of Jeremiah. Jeremiah predicts the destruction of Edom, and he predicts it at actually a pretty decent clip ahead of when it actually occurs, almost 500 years before it occurs. So he, I think, can be considered reliable just because of that.
The book of Jeremiah includes a prediction about the destruction of Edom, an ancient kingdom neighboring Israel, but several pieces of evidence suggest this wasn't actually written by Jeremiah in the early 500s BCE. First, ancient copies of the text show inconsistencies. Different versions place these predictions in different locations in the book, and some versions are much shorter than others. This suggests these predictions were originally separate writings that were collected and added to the book later. The language itself provides important clues. The text uses Hebrew words and grammar that only became common after the Babylonian exile, after 539 BCE, well after Jeremiah's time. It also describes details about Edom that would only be known to someone writing after certain historical events had already happened, like Edom's control of important trade routes and mountain fortresses in the Negev desert. The prediction shares many exact phrases with another biblical book, Obadiah, which historians generally agree was written after the exile. For example, both texts describe Edom as living in the clefts of the rocks and being brought down like an eagle. This suggests both writers were drawing from the same later tradition rather than receiving separate divine messages. The way the prediction describes Edom's destruction also doesn't match what actually happened. Archaeological discoveries show that Edom declined slowly over time as another group, the Nabateans, gradually took over their territory. This contradicts the prediction's description of a sudden, devastating destruction. While religious texts often use dramatic language, this doesn't explain why specific historical details are incorrect. The most likely explanation is that this prediction reflects the ongoing conflict between Israel and Edom rather than a supernatural vision of the future. Throughout the Bible, it's common to find harsh judgments against Israel's enemies, and Edom was a longtime rival. This suggests the text was written to express these political and religious tensions rather than to predict the future. This Jeremiah prophecy fails criterion number 1. It is not demonstrably written before the events it predicts.
Daniel, for example, predicts the end of the reign of Alexander the Great. He predicts also, and by the way, that prediction is pretty far in advance of it actually occurring, over 200 years. And then he predicts the reign of the Roman Empire. And so now you'll see this prediction occurs over a much longer period of time, about 500 years again, prior to its peak.
If the book of Daniel was actually written during the Jewish exile in Babylon, around 500 BCE, as traditionally believed, we would expect it to be very accurate about events from that time period, since the author would have witnessed them firsthand. We would also expect any predictions about the future to become less detailed the further ahead they looked, just like how we can make specific predictions about next year, but only vague guesses about what might happen in 50 years. However, the book shows an interesting opposite pattern. When discussing the Babylonian and Persian periods, which would have been the present and recent past for someone writing in 500 BCE, the details are sometimes vague or incorrect. But as the story moves forward in time, the descriptions become more and more precise, with the most detailed accounts describing events from the 160s BCE. Then, suddenly, the descriptions become vague again when talking about events after that time. Think of it this way. If you tried to write a history of the last 100 years without looking anything up, you could probably be very specific about events from the 2000s, generally accurate about the 1980s, but much less precise about earlier decades. The pattern in Daniel suggests the author was actually writing around 165 BCE and looking backward at history rather than writing in 500 BCE and predicting the future. This makes sense when we consider that Daniel is similar to other Jewish writings from the hundreds BCE, which often presented past events as predictions to show that God was in control of history. Scholars explain that this wasn't seen as dishonest. Instead, it was a way of showing how current events fit into God's larger plan. Daniel is not a book predicting the future, but a text written to encourage Jewish people during a time when their culture was threatened by Greek rulers. As with the others, the Daniel prophecies fail criterion number 1.
Keep in mind that since Jim is saying only a few sentences on each of these prophecies, I'm similarly presenting complex scholarly positions in only a few paragraphs. Again, thousands of pages have been written on each of these, so if they interest you, I'd encourage you to dig deeper. Or if you'd like detailed videos covering these, let me know in the comments.
And you will see that over and over again, you've got these reliable informants in the sense that they are prophets who make an accurate prediction.
Well, that's part of the problem, Jim. You haven't demonstrated that any of these men accurately predicted anything. For very compelling reasons that have nothing to do with ideological bias, mainstream scholars conclude that Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel are writing after the events you think they predicted, and the prediction made by Ezekiel didn't actually happen, even according to his own testimony. Your argument rests on there being obviously reliable informants, but a skeptical person has no reason to think that they are reliable future tellers.
All of these 4 reliable informants point to the coming Messiah.
Do they, though? You've probably seen some of those lists floating around out there, like 351 Old Testament prophecies fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And if you open the list, you get very underwhelming results, like born of a woman, or he thirsted, or firstborn, or rejected. Just detail after detail, so vague They could apply to huge swaths of the population. These all fail criteria 3, 4, and 5. They're mundane, not answerable by a single occurrence, and are highly open to interpretation. Now, do you remember those complaints Jim lodged in the opening? He's criticizing the gospel authors for not adhering to criterion number 2.
These prophecies they're citing as messianic, Jews don't think those are messianic. I'm reading the plain text in the Old Testament. I'm thinking, I wouldn't even assume this is messianic. This seems like it's describing the nation of Israel, or it's describing something that David did. Why would you think this is describing a future coming Messiah? Like, if you look at all these New Testament, half these dang things don't even seem like they're talking about the Messiah. And if you ask an ancient Jew, they would never have said that was even messianic to begin with. So if you're going to use those kinds of statements you happen to clip out of the Old Testament to make your case for Jesus, I'm out.
Most of what the New Testament points to as prophecy wasn't intended to be prophecy, at least not clearly intended to be prophecy. It is refreshing that Wallace is one of the few apologists who are at least willing to acknowledge that arbitrary labeling non-prophetic text as prophetic after the fact is unconvincing. And true to his brand, Jim has a crime-related analogy to try to help his case.
Now, I'll give you two kinds of evidence. Let's say, for example, that he left a shoe print, or even better, like DNA or a fingerprint. If he left a DNA print or a fingerprint or a shoe print, I could actually identify him before I print the shoe print. Let's say he left DNA. Well, that would be very clear evidence. If his DNA happens to be in a national database, I could identify my suspect from DNA and fingerprints before this dude ever even shows up. In other words, if I had a question, who's my suspect? I don't know who my suspect is. Well, I've got DNA at the crime scene. I've got fingerprints at the crime scene. Well, that kind of stuff points to a person of interest. Clear evidence, like DNA and fingerprints, point to a criminal before I ever meet him. So I can figure out who this guy is before I ever knock on his door. I'll know which door to knock on based on the clear evidence.
This is his metaphor for clear, specific prophecies that were actually intended to be prophecies, those that might pass my 6 criteria.
Let me go to another kind of evidence you sometimes find at crime scenes, like a button. Really? Is that button from the victim? I don't see a button missing on the victim's shirt. Or how about a hairband? Is that button or is that hairband from the... I one time had a piece of shoe foam left at a crime scene. Well, you cannot identify the suspect in advance. I'm not even sure these things belonged to the suspect. I knew they belonged to somebody. Now, if I meet the suspect years later or a couple of days later, and I find that his shirt is missing a button, well, then I will go, oh, this actually is evidence of a crime. This is cloaked evidence.
And this is his metaphor for vague text, not intended to be prophecy, but sure sounds familiar in hindsight.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme. Every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one.
The kind that would not pass my criteria. It's worth pointing out that Jim has created the terms clear evidence and cloaked evidence for his book. They're not an existing part of law enforcement vocabulary anywhere in the English-speaking world. His observation of the phenomenon may be valid, but it's not a concept that detectives give active consideration, let alone a standardized label. This is not a crime-solving distinction.
There are some prophecies that are so clear that when I read them, even before Jesus ever appeared, the first readers of that scripture would say, oh, clearly this is describing a coming Messiah, and it's describing him in a clear way. So these are the kinds of prophecies that would point to our Messiah before we ever meet him, just like other clear evidence in a crime scene. Now, there's other kinds of prophecies that are much more like the button, right? They're cloaked. They may or may not be, maybe you wouldn't even see them necessarily as belonging to the suspect. But after you meet the suspect, you'll find out, actually, you know what? Those things match the suspect. They identify him after the fact.
This is definitely putting the apology back into apologetics, giving the unconvincing alleged prophecies about Jesus some veneer of legitimacy. One can even potentially be on board here if there was a category of predictions clearly intended to be a prophecy, but are somewhat vague. The problem is, these vague claims still carry all of the objections Jim was complaining about.
And if you ask an ancient Jew, they would never have said that was even messianic to begin with.
They're not predictions. They're just literary parallels. There's a story about Jonah being in a fish for 3 days. And there's a story about Jesus being in a tomb for 3 days. That's a deliberate or coincidental similarity. That's not a prophecy.
Typically I see happening is people who are making a case for Jesus from prophecy, they lump these two kinds of prophecies together. And then we're looking at it and thinking, this is lame. Why should I trust any of your prophecies when half of them seem like they're not that clear? They're all cloaked. You can make anyone look like the fact after the fact. You can make anyone look like a suspect, right?
Right.
Now I'm going to put on the screen for you in white. Those are the clear prophecies. And in yellow, those are the cloaked prophecies. In other words, I want to eliminate the cloaked prophecies. So if we were to make a list right now of just what Moses and Job gives us, I'm only going to include the clear prophecies, just for sake of argument. Just the clear prophecies. I'm with you if you're skeptical about prophecy and how it's used to make a case for Jesus. I am too. So here we are. This is what you get from the earliest prophecies. And guess what? Pretty much every question that you have is still left unanswered.
Jim claims to be skeptical about prophecy, but he gives us no clear definition to decide when a prophecy is clear or cloaked in his parlance. He complained earlier that things Jewish rabbi would not consider to be prophecy were included, and yet Jim crushes evil at his own expense on his slide in white text to indicate that he classifies it as clear. Because I have a copy of his book,
in our book, we've got this all in the footnotes. Of course, in a presentation like this, you're going to trust me for this.
I can look up that his reference for this claim is Genesis 3:15, which is the passage where God is cursing the serpent for his role in tempting Eve. It reads, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Now, pre-Christian and modern non-Christian Jewish scholars generally do not consider Genesis 3:15 to be a messianic prophecy. To them, this is just a straightforward explanation for the instinctual hostility between humans and snakes. No different than the verse before it is a straightforward explanation for why snakes don't have legs. Without Christian retcon, Eve's offspring is best read as all of humanity. Not a single distinct individual descendant, having the snake represent evil, is also a retcon. And the verse does not use terms typically associated with messianic prophecies in Jewish tradition.
We won't go through each prophecy he presents, but this shows that Jim's criteria for a clear prophecy completely ignores criterion number 2, that the claim intends to be a prediction. This applies to all but a small handful of phrases Wallace is going to include on his slides. Virtually none were considered by Jews to be predictions before Jesus' arrival. And so I'm left wondering what criteria Wallace uses to call a prophecy cloaked. He has "whose bones will not be broken," which his book connects to Exodus 12:46, which is a verse about the Passover meal. It says, "It must be eaten inside the house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones." I mean, that's a command to not break bones, not a prediction about someone not having broken bones. Should I point to Exodus 20:13, which commands, "You shall not murder," and claim that's a failed prophecy of Jesus, since he was in fact murdered? Jim's right. It's bad, but it's not significantly worse than the crushing the snake one. Neither were intended to be a prophecy. Neither is clear. Both need contortionist-level interpretation. Wallace expressed these complaints.
These prophecies they're citing as messianic, Jews don't think those are messianic. I'm reading the plain text in the Old Testament, and I'm thinking, I wouldn't even assume this is messianic. This seems like it's describing the nation of Israel, or it's describing something that David did. Why would you think this is describing a future coming Messiah? Like, if you look at all these New Testament, half these dang things don't even seem like they're talking about the Messiah. And if you ask an ancient Jew, they would never have said that was even messianic to begin with. So if you're going to use those kinds of statements you happen to clip out of the Old Testament to make your case for Jesus, I'm out.
And yet is doing nothing at all to alleviate the problems with his clear cloaked distinction. He's putting vague and unintended prophecies in both camps. So it's a distinction without a difference. Jim's book is no help in clarifying. His chapter merely scolds Jews for not being as credulous as he is. Wallace's criteria can safely be described as what he personally finds compelling, with no root in rigorous scholarship or history.
Only the ones in white would I consider to be all that clear. So those are the only ones that I am willing to include on my list.
Confirmed. This distinction is entirely Jim's feelings about what he considers to be clear. And so we can skip over his many slides, meandering through his arbitrary categorizations.
So let's go take a look at our Jesus right now. And remember, we're going to look at two kinds of prophecies. Clear prophecies, I'll put those on the left, and cloaked prophecies, we'll put those on the right. So let's take a look at our clear prophecies. This not bad. These are clear prophecies that point to Jesus.
Since we've established that clear prophecies is just a synonym for ones Jim arbitrarily finds appealing, let's scratch the ones that he himself complained about, those not considered by Jewish scholars to be related to the Messiah. Obviously, there's no definitive unanimous list, but chapters like Isaiah 11, Micah 5, Jeremiah 23, and Daniel 7 are generally agreed upon as messianic, so we'll keep those. That leaves us with born in Bethlehem, enters Jerusalem on a donkey, reigns forever, descendant of Judah and son of man in quotations. I don't know how one could begin to demonstrate to a skeptic that Jesus is currently reigning and will be doing so forever, or that he's the son of man, whatever that's supposed to mean. There is no clarity on the definition. It's often just synonymous with Messiah, so that'd be very circular reasoning. He's the Messiah because he's the Messiah, descendant of Judah. That would be at least the whole southern kingdom, probably a lot more due to intermarriage pre- and post-exile. It's a little more specific than just saying Jewish, but not significantly so. Also, I have no idea how to demonstrate this for Jesus. The Bible says that Joseph was from Judah, but it also says Joseph lent no genetic material to Jesus. That he was born in Bethlehem is one of the least likely naturalistic claims about Jesus. He was so well known as being from Nazareth that two separate gospel authors were recording largely incompatible, credulity-stretching narratives to put his birth in Bethlehem in order to manufacture the appearance of fulfillment. These stories were entirely unreported by our earliest sources, Paul and Mark. And as for entering Jerusalem on a donkey, I've mentioned in several videos how Matthew in particular seems to be embellishing this story to align with his interpretation of the prophecy. But let's pretend for a minute that Jesus really did ride in on a donkey. In the story, Jesus is deliberately commanding his followers to find him a donkey for this day. If non-Messiah Jesus wanted to seem like Messiah Jesus, it would very much be in his control to try to make this happen. That's why criteria number 6 specifies against predictions that people can actively attempt to fulfill. That's just self-fulfilling and unimpressive. So yeah, I'm not exactly blown away by these. And lest you think I crossed off Wallace's best ones in my skepticism, take a look at what's on this list. Dwells in the midst of people, despised, enters the temple. That's everyone. Crushes evil, makes known the path of light, conquers death, redeems, intercedes for sinners, etc. These are theological claims, not historical claims. Again, there is no way to demonstrate that Jesus did any of these things. It's entirely pointless to argue about whether something is prophecy until such time as you can at least demonstrate that the alleged fulfillment took place. What we have is writers after the fact, whom even Wallace admits, were highly motivated to make prophetic connections to the point of labeling things prophecy that no one had ever considered to be prophecy. That sounds like a group that might also be prone to invent fulfillment claims.
So if you just, so I'm only going to look at the clear evidence from the reliable, the 4 reliables, you would have enough, I think, to make the case that Jesus actually fits it.
Couldn't disagree more.
First, we demonstrated that none of these 4 should be considered reliable. Then we demonstrated that Jim's criteria for clear prophecy just means the prophecies that he personally has a good feeling about, and is comprised mostly of statements scholars agree were not intended to be prophecy. Then we demonstrated that most of these are spiritual and cannot be verified scientifically or historically, while the remaining historical claims have not been reliably verified to have happened.
So if you look at these are the prophets that are pointing toward a person of interest, and it's clear that there's a person of interest coming, a redeemer, a restorer, a Messiah, a savior is coming. And they are pointing, but who is the savior?
That there is a who to identify is begging the question that this is prophecy that will be fulfilled. The most obvious answer is that no one was the Messiah, that whatever prophecy there was has failed.
Well, they're pointing to someone, and it turns out there's a reason why this Savior comes when he does.
Saying that Jesus couldn't possibly come until the prophecies were made and fulfilled is a ridiculous thing to say when you're positing that he's simultaneously an all-powerful God who can do anything. God gave Noah just a year's notice before flooding the whole planet and needed just 6 days to create the entire universe. So he doesn't actually need to adhere to a slow communication plan of his own making. Also, it looks like every century or so, God was giving people a Messiah update. Why can't we have a rapture update every 100 years or so? This is just a weird way to think about things. Assuming your conclusion.
Because as that prophetic fuse is burning down toward the appearance, the end of the BC, or the BC, before the Common Era, and the beginning of the Common Era, these questions are being answered in that sequence until finally the only question left to answer is the who question.
No, the question is the title of your video. Is Jesus in the Old Testament? I'm going to say no, and at very least, the case is far too weak to convince someone who isn't already convinced. I wouldn't use this one on a skeptic. I think Jim said it best.
This is lame. Why should I trust any of your prophecies when half of them seem like they're not that clear?
For more of this former Christian, taking a look at the claims of the former cold case detective, tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.